type setting. So I think one of the things we talked about is the use of technology for identifying misbehavior by roadway users, using potential monitoring technology to identify cases where people are driving distracted, or drunk driving, or not wearing their seatbelt, or speeding. So kind of multi-use technology that would identify those types of infractions, and possibly using technology that would provide public with empowerment to also to report other roadway users that they might see being guilty of an infraction. One of the other things we looked at is sort of the use of technology. So a lot of discussion around automated vehicles and connected vehicles, and how to really use that technology, maybe having different regulations depending on the type of vehicle and the operating area that it's in. So if you had a low-speed vehicle, it might have different operating rules than a vehicle that would be operating in a high-speed environment. Another enabler to that, though, would be really investment in research of these new technologies and how you can get them to the marketplace and get consumers to trust and adopt them. And also, when you have these new technologies, what is the role of data going to be? So how do you leverage the information that's collected, not only to understand how the systems are working, but how they can be refined and improved in future? And beyond that, how the systems are operating within the larger network system. So can you make improvements to the roadway environment as well? Another part would be investment in enabling infrastructure to support that connected vehicle technology. So there would be a lot of back-end analysis that would have to be done. So you would have to figure out how best to acquire that information. But at the same time, we had a lot of back and forth about the privacy issues, and whether drivers would be willing to make accommodations for sharing data in certain circumstances. Potentially, if you have access to a certain roadway, you may be giving up certain privacy protections or something like that. Also, understanding what the role of incentives to promote acceptance of new technology. So if there are proven benefits, are there ways through insurance that could be used to incentivize people to either purchase vehicles with new technology, or adapt their driving behavior accordingly. And then this morning's presentation, discussing technology to improve EMS response. And finally, using existing infrastructure more effectively will be really important. That kind of lends itself to the vehicle communication and the vehicle infrastructure communication, and really building it out in a way that can accommodate new technologies that will be coming down the pike. And I'll maybe really repeating some of the challenges that we've encountered now. So that summarizes what Group 1 came up with. Not sure where Group 2 is.
Before we get started on 2, is there any questions or comments for Group 1? Okay, well, we'll move to Group 2.
So to borrow from a rental car ad a few years ago, we're number 2, but we try harder. So I think that's what it said anyway. So we had a very interesting and mix of expertise, but we started big. So what can this group contribute to the infrastructure discussion in Congress? Well, the first thing is that each and every project ought to specifically consider safety as an objective, but safety not in a political sense, but safety driven by data. As to how do you prioritize various projects based upon safety, and a major contribution this group can make is what will really work to address the safety issue to help us achieve the metric which we've set out, which is the 0 fatalities. We're going to have to be smart about it. We're going to have to be dealing with it in a bipartisan way, and we're going to have to recognize that there are strong advocates for various types of investment in infrastructure. But we've got to insist that safety be considered, and that consideration be fact-based and based on the data that this group can provide in terms of where you prioritize your expenditures. In addition, in terms of big picture, we really need to adequately fund and support alternatives to motor vehicles, such as transit, teleworking, and other things like that, so you reduce the overall exposure before you then go down the various paths of okay, here's what you do in terms of technology in the vehicle, technology in the highways. So we started big, and then we had a number of specific proposals, reminders that we should be concerned with not only technology in personal automobiles, but technology in commercial vehicles as well. We need to obviously look at how we incentivize the states and localities to pass laws that are effective and then enforce those laws. So that's a key consideration. And then a lot of interest in applying good design standards and technological features in the infrastructure as well as in the vehicles. So for those in number 2, if you had any other comments that you wanted to make about sort of our approach, please feel free. Okay, thanks much.
Thank you. Any questions for group 2? Okay, let's move to group 3.
Sorry about that. We're way in the back. So we have an infrastructure bill. So the first thing that came up for us is, well, with $1 trillion, so we should take a piece of the pie and dedicate it to existing programs, whether it's 8SIP or the menu of highway safety programs that NHTSA has. And it would be like an infusion of cash into those existing programs. The other thought we had was that this could be a mechanism to increase flexibility for states to dedicate that funding in the way that they see fit and make states more eligible for funds if they're not already. The number 2 kind of actually has 2 parts. The first thing is that the basic idea is to unfreeze the regulatory freeze for US DOT, because there's a lot of regulations that are important for safety, and we'd want to kickstart that process again. And we also had the thought that maybe there are regulations that Congress could direct US DOT to accelerate. One thought was standardization of certain kinds of roadway infrastructure, but I'm sure there are many other examples as well. Second part of that was, so we have distracted driving and impaired driving and speeding and occupant protection, and we've had programs going on for quite a long time on the federal level to try and address these, the incentive programs. Is that working as well as it ought to? Should we, as a coalition, rethink what the federal approach ought to be? Could it be, loosening those incentive programs to give more states more flexibility and giving them more money? Could it be consideration of sanctions? It's a conversation that the coalition probably ought to have, recognizing that this might be perhaps a controversial suggestion to make. We had a number of ideas that are kind of like new starts, new start investments in technologies that enhance safety, like ITS, autonomous vehicles, that sort of thing. Investment in non-motorized road users, cyclists and pedestrians, but also recognizing that we often group cyclists and pedestrians together, but the countermeasures are often different, so maybe they ought to be decoupled for the purposes of new programs. An idea was to invest in more education on road safety within school systems and workplaces. Maybe there ought to be some sort of new program to invest in that. And then finally, identifying gaps. So we heard a presentation today about all of these problems with emergency medical systems. And it sounds like there ought to be some sort of national program or national approach to help to remedy that. No one in our group had a lot of expertise in that issue, but we thought perhaps the best first step would be to have stakeholders or federal agencies collaborate on a project to identify where the gaps are on the national level in the emergency medical response system. And then our last idea would be to take the infrastructure bill and we'd want to reorient it towards safety. It probably wasn't conceived as, we need to invest in infrastructure to address the safety programs, but perhaps that's the way that we ought to have to sell it to Congress in the way that we would hope that Congress, whatever comes out of Congress, it should be framed up as, we're doing all of this and making all the investments to try and improve safety. And then finally, the last thought we had was our role, the Road to Zero message. Should it be the safe systems approach based on data, based on measurement? That's something that the coalition's discussed at a previous meeting, and we just want to put that up again for the coalition's consideration. Any questions?
Great.
Hello. So we're group 4, and as Dia said, we can breathe no more. C5, you might be alive. C7, see you in heaven. C1, you're done. C2, you're through. It clicked in my head after.
Finally. I said you were rusty.
I am rusty. I am rusty. It's been a while since I've been in the back of a truck. So our group, actually, one of the things that our group brought up that I thought was a really interesting perspective was, let's look at seatbelts. Why does everyone wear seatbelts? Why, what happened from in the 70s and 80s when kids rode on mom's lap in the front seat of a car to today when they're in basically armored car seats to the point where our EMS providers don't even want to take them out of the car seats. Just keep them in the thing and take them to the hospital right in the giant crash vest that they're wearing, basically. So first thing was public education and information sharing. So we took these things and broke them into buckets. We got the word out, click it or ticket, seatbelts save lives, those crazy crash videos where you see the dummies snap in their heads and then the dummies talk about how much it hurt when they have half their head missing. Those things were effective. So public education, enforcement, click it or ticket, law enforcement's ability to actually enforce the laws saying you have to wear the seatbelt and having laws on the books that say you have to wear them. So there's an enforcement component. And now you look at, well, what's killing people today? Why is there back an uptick? Well, there's an uptick because everybody's on their phones all the time. Technology has actually made things a little more dangerous for us. So you can put programs in these buckets, information sharing, enforcement, technology, so that you can actually make things safer. We also created a few more buckets. For technology, we talked about V to V, V to I, and then we added a new V, V to P, which is vehicle to public safety. For enforcement, we also talked about leveraging technology. For technology, we talked about the Next Gen 911 program and how to integrate that with our roadways, especially in rural areas, increasing rural areas' communication abilities. We talked about autonomous vehicles. We also talked about work zone safety, wearable tech for workers, vehicle integration into work zones so that the vehicle automatically slows down. A few different concepts came up. And then for infrastructure, the hard infrastructure, we actually had a really interesting conversation about that. So first of all, we talked about all users. So much like Group 3, we talked about bicycle and pedestrian being separate things. We talked about different types of roadways, different types of infrastructure. We talked about road diet, culture shift, and road design. So grant eligibility, design for safety. Another thing on road structure that I thought was an interesting point was we had a manufacturer in our group, and she pointed out that when they're talking about creating vehicles that are smart and can sense things in the roadway, sense lane departure, things like that, state to state, county to county, lanes are different, roadways are different. So one of the things we talked about was some form of standardization with the understanding that you still need to innovate. So innovation in this roadway design is very important. Testing of new designs. When you look at bike lanes, should they be separate of parallel park vehicles, or should the bike lane be inside the parallel park vehicles? Just little things like that that make things safer. We talked about post-event coordination. That had a lot to do with what Dia presented on today. So that's trauma integration, EMS, and then the communications piece. Actually, in the 70s, the federal government created a frequency band called CMED. It's still being used in the Northeast, pretty much not being used anywhere else, but leveraging that central communications concept for trauma system and trauma design. And then best practices was our last bucket. And within that, we talked about contract reform, going from low bid to best performing bid. Simple things like that. The GSA contracting process is just a little complicated. So looking at making things streamlined, simpler, and safer for our workers. Any questions? Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, group 5.
Thank you. So I'm Andy Clark with Tool Design Group. Group number 5. We named the bill. It's the break all the rules bill, but it's it's a little bit of a stealth operation because within that we actually want the White House to organize and like step up and say Vision Zero is the goal, have a Vision Zero task force to oversee the kind of implementation of this safety infrastructure bill. We even want the Safety Council to get not a $1 million grant program, but maybe $1 billion grant program for, to give out in grants to folks to innovate and to carry this work forward. Like Group 3, we talked a lot about supporting the existing FAST Act and fully funding the legislation, fully supporting the safety performance measure, the Highway Safety Improvement Program funds, making sure that that is all well used and well utilized. That was a big part of the conversation. We also talked a lot about rewards or sanctions to create that safety culture that we all acknowledge is essential to promote good design. If we want V2I in our new roads, we need to make sure we're not just using $1 trillion to dust off 1950s highway projects, but we're actually building new roads that are not adding capacity, not adding vehicle miles of travel, and not doing a bunch of stuff that we know is bad, and is actually moving the ball forward again with that V2I technology, with the safety improvements we know are possible. Like Group 2, we wanted to acknowledge we want this program, this bill, this $1 trillion, to acknowledge the link between crashes, VMT, speed, factors that we know are inextricably linked, and make sure that that safe systems thinking really comes through. So if you want an 85-mile-an-hour road in Texas, which we gather people do, whether that's right or wrong, there's a price to pay in terms of the design, of the level of separation, and the type of infrastructure that's provided. If you're not prepared to do that, then you can't have 85-mile-an-hour speeds. If you're not prepared to build those separated bike lanes and bike tracks and put in crosswalks and stuff, then you can't have 55-mile-an-hour suburban roads. They have to be 25 miles an hour so people can survive. Building that critical safe systems thinking in was a part of our conversation. Also, making sure that the equity issues, starting with data collection, are truly addressed so that those populations that are disproportionately affected by traffic crashes are addressed appropriately, which is not really happening now. If people are going to be using more transit, more walking, more bicycling, particularly in older neighborhoods that have been underinvested in for years, let's make sure that investment is focused in those areas. We identified that the countermeasures we're talking about exist. We just need to do more to show how they work, to incentivize their use, to reward good behavior. The issue is choosing to use those techniques and those technologies. The discussion of safety culture came up a lot. Vehicle safety standards may not be part of a infrastructure bill, but we know those exist. We need to make sure that the culture of government enables us to enforce and create those regulations that we know will benefit us. And to do that, we talked about needing more storytelling, more effective education to change behavior, and again, rewards and incentives for people to do the right thing.
Any questions?
Hi, I'm Stephanie Pratt from NIOSH. Like Group 5, we talked a lot about the need to institutionalize the zero death goal and the safe system approach and establish that legislatively with support from the administration as well, because that's an important underpinning for any legislation, any infrastructure bill and future legislation that may come about. In the near term, we discussed the fact that the general public probably doesn't know a lot about the current crisis in traffic safety deaths, so it's important that the public, grassroots advocacy, safety organizations get mobilized to influence legislators, because if legislators don't hear about it from their constituents, they don't care. We also talked about it at high level, the need to continue to look at an approach to tie funding to states to the strength of their road safety laws, but certainly allowing enough flexibility for states to make decisions based on their own priorities. We talked about a few different approaches to take in an infrastructure bill. One was to look at introducing high-risk rural roads, emphasis, countermeasures to reduce single-vehicle crashes, run-off-the-road crashes, fatigue-related crashes, which affect both the general public and workers specifically. Along the themes of public and private partnerships, the need to increase the use of engineering simulations that would help us to evaluate the need for prioritizing the rebuilding of existing infrastructure and then making sure that newly constructed infrastructure is as safe as possible. We talked about the need for following on to the legislation that's proposed on automated vehicles by incorporating connected vehicle technology in the infrastructure so that we can continue to build the vehicle-to-vehicle, vehicle-to-infrastructure, and vehicle-to-EMS that we just heard about into projects so that even though all of this is not a reality, it will lay the groundwork for it to become a reality so that we don't have to go back and redo it in a decade. And then incentives in projects to have entities collaborate across the non-traditional partners, and that's following a similar theme, I think, that is one of the themes of this coalition. And finally, we heard this morning from our legislative representatives that an infrastructure bill is likely to come out of Environment and Public Works. It's likely to come out of Commerce. So we have to think about the particular challenge of incorporating safety. For us, safety is the only argument, but it's likely that an infrastructure bill is going to be sold as a job creation bill. So we're kind of out there competing with different messages that are going to resonate with different groups. So all the more reason for us to aggressively pursue safety as a component of the infrastructure bill.
Okay, well, I think that's through the groups. We'll turn it back over to Debbie.
Thanks. Thank you, JT. Thank you to all the steering group members and the volunteers that facilitated. And thanks for all the participation. We have a lot of information here. Some we could see there were multiple groups that were coming up with some of the same concepts. And so that's a good thing. That will help us. We'll bring this information back to the steering group and we'll determine if there are ways that we can engage. Certainly some of the things that we could consider as a coalition are letters, are potentially talking points, participating in hearings by testifying, other activities. And so what we'd like to do is bring this information back to the steering group, see if we can consolidate it into some documents that we could use going forward. Listening to the panelists this morning, that things might move a little bit slowly as they start to try to figure out how to pay for it. That can only help us because it gives us a little bit more time to come back to the group and talk through some of these things. In the meantime, Jonathan made his presentation this morning about some of the survey results. We're also looking at the steering group to talk about how we can engage the people in this room and also the 77 people who are on the webcast in some work group activities. And so some of you may have some areas of focus that you want to pursue with more specificity. And so we want to try to begin to trigger some of those opportunities, and that may mean creating some documents that we can all work from, but it also may mean some advocacy efforts in places where they make sense. And so those are some of the things that the steering group's talking about, and we look forward to coming back to you. Susan, we have our next meeting on June 13th, and Susan just shared with me some feedback from you all that there's an interest to try to get back downtown in DC, and so we'd certainly look for opportunities to do that. We are trying to run the coalition at a low cost, and so if any of you here have facilities downtown that could accommodate a large room, that we could webcast, and that we would have space for breakouts, we would love to hear about it. We are happy to kind of rotate locations, but we're looking for facilities that can give us those capabilities. And I think particularly the webcast one is the one that is a challenge for us. So I just want to thank all of you for your participation. We've got the next meeting coming up on the 13th, but I think we've got some opportunities to focus on some action-oriented efforts in the near term. And so the steering group will come back to you with some of those ways to participate. We will have the grant announcement. Probably we're shooting for mid-month this month, and so that will keep us on track with those expectations and announcements. Again, the hardest job is making those selections because there were so many good applications. Was there anything that anyone here expected to engage in or to hear that they didn't hear today, or maybe something that a loop that hasn't been closed? Yes, sir.
I just had a quick question. Is there an easy way for us coalition members to find each other and contact each other? Is it on the website, or did I miss that?
Sure. So we have the list of organizations that are involved, but I would say that I know, looking at the room, sometimes the individuals that participate change some, and so that's not always the same person from the same organization. So one of the things we've wanted to do is be really careful so that we don't share the list and then other people are using the list of emails and things in a way that you all are getting spammed or getting lobbied or contacted on things. And so we'll try to figure out a way, but I would absolutely encourage you, if there are people that you want to engage with, to communicate with them and get cards and do some of that exchange directly. But maybe we'll get some consent coming back from the coalition about how to share information. We just want to be really respectful. We value your contact information, and we don't want to abuse it. And the group's getting larger, and so then we kind of have less control as to where the list goes beyond that. So we'll come back to you all, but that's a great request. And so we just need to work through that. It's kind of like the privacy issue with respect to data collection, right? So are there any other questions? Yes.
Will there be bullet points from all of the wonderful speakers and the breakout sessions put on a website?
So we do record these activities as part of the webcast agreement here. The whole thing can be viewed, so for people who can't participate, they can see it. We also have the presentations, and so those get posted, and we will summarize these. It's kind of hard to see all of these. So we'll figure out how to summarize them in a way and post up the documents, but they will, for the most part, not be a prioritization. It's just going to be a laundry list of some of the things that were discussed. But there are multiple ways for people to get information. We want to be as transparent as possible. Yes?
Is it okay to take pictures of these discussions?
Yes, absolutely. That's certainly one way for you to document, is you can take a photo. I know that Susan will be doing that, so we can make sure we transcribe everything. I know we had someone from GW that wanted to share an announcement, so if you want to come on up. Just want to say thank you all for your commitment. We look forward, we're putting together a strategic plan, so we look forward to sharing that with you at the next meeting, and that will help guide some of the ways that we engage and some of the priorities that we have. And so we really appreciate all you've done, and to all the folks who are on the webcast, we will be following up with you to get your input and feedback, just like the folks here in the room. So I'd just like to close out with an announcement and our thanks. Have a safe travel, safe trip home.
I'm Helena Roisman. I'm the Injury Prevention and Outreach Coordinator at George Washington University Hospital, one of the local level 1 trauma centers here. And I just wanted to have a captive audience here. We're having a Vision Zero Summit. We're hosting the space. We're not planning the event. The Washington Area Bicycle Association is in charge of planning the event, but I just wanted to open the invitation and let you all know about the event that's happening. It's on March 31st, which is a Friday, from 8:30 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. at the Milken Institute of Public Health, which is on our campus. And you'll hear from speakers, expert panelists, and there'll be some breakout sessions. So it's a good opportunity to get your voice heard. And as it relates to kind of the regional Vision Zero initiative. So if anyone is interested, please just give me your contact information. I can forward you the registration details. Thanks.